The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the town of Mesa Verde, turning the dusty streets into ribbons of heat that shimmered like mirages in the late afternoon light. Marcus Sullivan adjusted his worn leather hat and urged his horse toward the hitching post outside the Copper Dollar Saloon, his throat parched from a long day of moving cattle across the drought-stricken range that stretched endlessly in all directions from this small desert town. At 28, Marcus had the weathered hands and sun-darkened skin of a man who had spent his entire adult life working under the relentless Arizona sky. He was known throughout Mesa Verde as a quiet, reliable cowboy who kept to himself, did his work without complaint, and treated everyone with the kind of steady politeness that came from being raised by parents who valued decency above social standing. The Copper Dollar was busier than usual for a Thursday afternoon, filled with the kind of men who had finished their work early and were looking to wash the dust from their throats before heading home to suppers and families. Marcus recognized most of the faces, ranch hands, shopkeepers, and the occasional traveling businessman who found himself stranded in Mesa Verde by the vagaries of the territorial transportation system. But as Marcus approached the bar, he became aware of a conversation taking place at one of the corner tables that made his stomach tighten with discomfort. The voices were deliberately loud, pitched to carry across the room in the way. That meant the speakers wanted their words to be overheard, and their opinions to be noted by everyone present. I heard she went begging for work at the Henderson place today, said Pete Morrison, a ranch foreman whose red face and loud voice made him the unofficial leader of the saloon's gossip sessions. Can you imagine that woman showing up at a respectable family's door, asking to do their washing and cooking like she hadn't brought shame on this whole town? The gall of some people, agreed Tom Bradley, nodding his head with the satisfied expression of someone participating in community moral judgment. A decent woman would have left Mesa Verde after what happened. Would have found somewhere else to start over instead of staying here to remind us all of her husband's disgrace. Marcus ordered his whiskey and tried to ignore the conversation, but the voices grew louder and more vicious as the men warmed to their topic. Other patrons had begun to pay attention, some joining in with their own comments and observations, others listening with the kind of uncomfortable attention that came from witnessing cruelty they felt powerless to stop. The woman they were discussing was Elena Vasquez, the widow of Roberto Vasquez, who had died 6 months ago under circumstances that had provided Mesa Verde with its most scandalous gossip in years. Roberto had been caught stealing cattle from his employer, had been fired in disgrace, and had died in a drunken fight outside this very saloon 3 days later, leaving Elena alone in a community that had always viewed her with suspicion and now treated her with open hostility. Elena was Mexican, which in Mesa Verde meant she was automatically considered foreign and potentially dangerous. Despite having lived in the town for 5 years and never causing trouble for anyone, she was also beautiful, which had made her the subject of jealous speculation among the local women and inappropriate attention from some of the men. But most damning of all, she was now a widow without family support, which made her vulnerable to the kind of cruelty that small communities sometimes visited upon those who couldn't defend themselves. I saw her at the general store yesterday, contributed Jake Wilson, a young clerk who worked for one of the local merchants. She was trying to sell some of her husband's things, his tools, his saddle, even his wedding ring. Pathetic, really. A woman reduced to pawning her dead husband's belongings just to buy food. The laughter that greeted this comment was ugly, tinged with the satisfaction that came from witnessing someone else's misfortune from a position of relative security. Marcus felt his jaw clench as he listened to these men he worked alongside. Men he had considered friends, taking pleasure in the suffering of a woman who had done nothing to deserve their contempt, except marry someone who had made terrible decisions. Maybe she should have thought about that before she married a thief, said Pete Morrison, his voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had never been tested by real hardship. Decent women don't end up in situations like that. There's usually a reason when someone falls so far. Marcus set his glass down on the bar with more force than necessary, the sharp sound cutting through the laughter and conversation like a knife. The room grew quieter as several men turned to look at him, surprised by the sudden tension in his posture and the expression on his face that suggested he was no longer content to be a passive observer. Maybe, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet saloon. Decent men don't sit around gossiping about a woman's troubles like old ladies at a sewing circle. The silence that followed his words was absolute. Pete Morrison's face flushed an even deeper red as he processed the implication of Marcus's comment, while the other men at the table looked back and forth between the two like spectators at a prize fight who couldn't decide which fighter to bet on. "Excuse me?" Pete said, his tone carrying the dangerous edge that preceded frontier violence. Marcus turned to face the corner table, his own voice remaining calm but his eyes hard as flint. "I said maybe you boys should find something better to do with your time than tearing down a woman who's just trying to survive." What happened next would be talked about in Mesa Verde for years to come, and would establish Marcus Sullivan as either a man of unusual honor or a fool too stubborn to mind his own business, depending on who was telling the story. Pete Morrison stood up from his chair with the deliberate slowness of a man who wanted everyone in the saloon to understand that he was preparing for confrontation. At 45, Pete was both older and larger than Marcus, with the kind of hard-earned reputation for toughness that came from 20 years of settling disputes with his fists when words proved insufficient. "Marcus Sullivan," Pete said, his voice carrying the particular tone that frontiermen used when they were offering someone a chance to back down before things went too far. "I think you might want to reconsider what you just said. This doesn't concern you, and Elena Vasquez sure as hell isn't worth getting yourself hurt over." Marcus remained at the bar, his posture relaxed, but his eyes never leaving Pete's face. The other patrons of the Copper Dollar had gone completely silent, recognizing the signs of a confrontation that was about to escalate beyond words. In a town like Mesa Verde, where entertainment was scarce and social tensions ran high, a good fight was something to be witnessed and discussed for weeks afterward. "Anytime men decide to amuse themselves by tearing down someone who can't fight back," Marcus replied evenly, "it concerns every decent person in hearing distance. And Elena Vasquez is worth more than the lot of you seem to understand." Tom Bradley, still seated at the corner table, but clearly nervous about the direction the conversation was taking, tried to inject some levity into the situation. "Come on, Marcus, we're just having a conversation. No harm in a little talk among friends." "Friends?" Marcus repeated, turning his attention to Tom. "Is that what you call it when you sit around discussing how pathetic it is that a woman has to sell her dead husband's belongings to buy food? When you laugh about her going door to door looking for honest work?" Jake Wilson, the youngest of the group and clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the room, spoke up in a voice that was meant to be conciliatory. "We didn't mean anything cruel by it, Marcus. It's just that, well, you have to admit, her situation is unusual. A woman alone with her husband's reputation—" "Her husband's reputation," Marcus interrupted, "not hers. Roberto Vasquez made his own choices, and he paid for them with his life. That doesn't make Elena responsible for his mistakes, and it sure as hell doesn't give you the right to treat her like she's some kind of criminal." Pete Morrison took a step closer to the bar, his hand resting casually near the gun that hung at his hip. "You're awfully concerned about a Mexican woman's reputation, Sullivan. Makes a man wonder if there's something personal in all this righteous indignation." The implication in Pete's words was clear, and Marcus felt anger rise in his chest like a flash fire. In the social climate of Mesa Verde, suggesting that a white man had inappropriate interest in a Mexican woman was both an insult and an accusation that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. "What's personal," Marcus said, his voice growing harder, "is watching men I thought I knew act like jackals around someone who deserves better. Elena Vasquez is a decent woman who's been dealt a hard hand by life. She's working to support herself honestly instead of begging for charity or leaving town like a coward. That makes her more honorable than most people I know. The bartender, an older man named Sam, who had seen too many fights start over smaller provocations, stepped forward with the kind of nervous authority that came from trying to maintain peace in an establishment that depended on avoiding the kind of violence that brought unwanted attention from territorial authorities. "Gentlemen," Sam said, his voice carrying the practiced diplomacy of someone whose livelihood depended on keeping customers happy, "maybe we should all just calm down and—" "No," Marcus said firmly, not taking his eyes off Pete Morrison. "I think it's time some things were said clearly. Elena Vasquez has been living in this town for 5 years. In all that time, has anyone here ever seen her cause trouble? Has she ever been disrespectful to anyone? Has she ever asked for anything she wasn't willing to work for?" The silence that greeted his questions was telling. Even Pete Morrison seemed to struggle for a response that would justify the community's treatment of Elena without acknowledging that Marcus was right about her character. "She married a thief," Tom Bradley offered. "Weakly, she married a man who became a thief," Marcus corrected. "And when she found out what he'd done, she didn't defend him or make excuses for him. She accepted that he'd made terrible choices, and she's been trying to build an honest life ever since. That takes more courage than most of us will ever be asked to show." Marcus turned to address the room at large, his voice carrying to every corner of the saloon. "I've worked alongside most of you men for years. I've seen how you treat your wives and daughters, how you talk about the importance of protecting women and children. But Elena Vasquez is a woman without male protection, in a town that's decided to punish her for her dead husband's crimes. And instead of offering help or even basic courtesy, you sit around making jokes about her misfortune." He paused, looking from face to face among the assembled men. "If that's the kind of men we are, then maybe we're not as civilized as we like to think." Pete Morrison's face had grown so red it was nearly purple, and his hand was now resting openly on the grip of his pistol. "You finished preaching, Sullivan? Because I'm getting tired of being lectured by someone who doesn't know when to mind his own business." Marcus straightened, his own hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. The moment had come when words would either resolve the conflict or give way to violence that could leave men dead on the saloon floor. "I'm finished," Marcus said quietly. "When you're finished using a woman's pain for your entertainment." What happened next surprised everyone in the room, including Marcus himself. The swinging doors of the Copper Dollar Saloon burst open with a force that made every man in the room turn toward the entrance, hands moving instinctively toward weapons before they saw who had arrived. Elena Vasquez stood framed in the doorway, her dark eyes taking in the scene with the quick intelligence of someone who had learned to read dangerous situations from long experience. She was smaller than most of the men in the room remembered, barely 5 feet tall, with the kind of delicate bone structure that made her appear fragile, until you looked into her eyes and saw the steel that had carried her through months of isolation and hostility. Her dress was simple but clean, mended in several places with the careful stitches of someone who couldn't afford to replace clothing but refused to appear in public, looking anything less than respectable. "I heard voices," Elena said, her English precise, despite the slight accent that marked her as foreign in the eyes of Mesa Verde's residents. "I was walking past, and I heard someone speaking my name." The silence in the saloon stretched uncomfortably as every man present tried to figure out how much of their conversation Elena might have overheard. Pete Morrison's hand moved away from his gun, but his posture remained aggressive, as if he was debating whether Elena's presence made the situation better or worse. Marcus felt his heart sink as he realized that Elena had walked into the middle of a confrontation that could easily turn violent, putting herself in danger just by being present. But there was something in her bearing that suggested she hadn't stumbled into the saloon by accident. She had heard enough to know what was being discussed, and she had chosen to enter, despite the obvious risks. "Mrs. Vasquez," Marcus said carefully, "this isn't a good time. Maybe I should hear what these men have been saying about me," Elena interrupted, her voice carrying a quiet authority that commanded attention. "Maybe I should know what opinions are being shared so freely about my character and my circumstances." She stepped fully into the saloon, letting the doors swing shut behind her, and Marcus noticed that her hands were steady despite what must have been considerable nervousness about confronting a room full of hostile men. Elena had obviously decided that silence and avoidance were no longer serving her interests, and she was prepared to face her accusers directly. "Well," she said, looking around the room with the kind of direct gaze that made grown men uncomfortable. "I assume someone was speaking about my attempts to find work? About my visits to various households in town?" Tom Bradley shifted nervously in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with having the subject of their gossip present to defend herself. "Mrs. Vasquez, we were discussing how pathetic it is that I have to sell my husband's belongings to buy food," Elena said flatly. "You were laughing about how I go door to door looking for honest work. You were suggesting that a decent woman would have left Mesa Verde rather than staying to remind you of her husband's disgrace." The accuracy of her summary made it clear that Elena had heard considerably more of their conversation than anyone had realized. Jake Wilson looked like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards, while Pete Morrison's expression grew even more hostile at being confronted by the woman he had been mocking. "You were eavesdropping," Pete said accusingly. "I was walking past on a public street," Elena replied calmly. "You were speaking loudly enough to be heard in the next county. If you didn't want your opinions overheard, perhaps you should have spoken more quietly." Marcus watched Elena face down a room full of men who had been tearing apart her reputation moments before, and felt a surge of admiration for her courage that made his earlier defense of her seem inadequate by comparison. Here was a woman who had lost everything, who faced hostility and rejection every day, who had every reason to be broken and defeated. Yet she stood straight and spoke with dignity that shamed her accusers. "Since you seem so interested in my circumstances," Elena continued, "perhaps you would like to hear the truth, rather than speculating about it. Yes, I am trying to find work. Yes, I have sold my husband's possessions to survive. Yes, I remain in Mesa Verde, despite the fact that many of you would prefer I disappear." She paused, her gaze moving from face to face around the room. "I remain here because this is my home. I have done nothing to be ashamed of, nothing that requires me to run away like a criminal. My husband made terrible choices, but they were his choices, not mine. I will not be driven away by gossip and cruelty from people who have never faced the kind of hardship that tests a person's true character." The power of her words was undeniable, delivered with a kind of quiet strength that made her attackers look petty and small by comparison. Marcus felt pride swell in his chest, not just for having defended her, but for recognizing what others had missed about Elena Vasquez's true nature. But Pete Morrison wasn't finished. His face was still flushed with anger and embarrassment, and Elena's dignified response had only made him more determined to reassert his authority in the situation. "Your husband was a thief," Pete said bluntly. "He stole cattle. He brought shame on this town, and he died in a drunken brawl like the criminal he was. You can stand there and talk about dignity all you want, but facts are facts." Elena absorbed this verbal assault without flinching, though Marcus could see the pain it caused her flickering briefly in her dark eyes. When she responded, her voice was even quieter than before, but it carried a weight that made everyone in the room lean forward to hear her words. "You are right," she said simply. "Roberto stole cattle. Roberto brought shame on himself, and by extension, on me. Roberto died in a fight that he started with his own poor choices. These are facts, and I do not deny them. She paused, and when she continued, her words carried the force of absolute conviction. But I am not Roberto. His crimes are not my crimes, his shame is not my shame, and his death does not make me responsible for his failures. I have worked to support myself honestly since the day he died. I have asked no one for charity, blamed no one for my circumstances, and caused trouble for no one in this community. Elena's gaze fixed on Pete Morrison with laser intensity. If you wish to judge me for my own actions. But if all you can find to criticize about Elena Vasquez is that she married unwisely, then perhaps your energy would be better spent examining your own choices rather than condemning mine. The silence that followed was deafening, and Marcus realized that Elena Vasquez had just accomplished something remarkable. She had walked into a room full of hostile men and, through sheer force of character and truth, had turned the moral advantage completely in her favor. The confrontation at the Copper Dollar had lasted less than 20 minutes, but Marcus knew that those 20 minutes would have consequences that extended far beyond the walls of the saloon. As Elena Vasquez walked out of the establishment with her dignity intact and her accusers thoroughly shamed, Marcus realized that his public defense of her had aligned him permanently with the most controversial figure in Mesa Verde. Pete. Morrison had backed down from the physical confrontation. Elena's presence and her powerful self-defense had made violence seem petty and cruel, rather than justified, but his parting words to Marcus carried the promise of social repercussions that could affect every aspect of his life in the small community. You made your choice, Sullivan, Pete had said as the tension in the room gradually dissipated. Don't expect the rest of us to forget it. Now, 2 hours after leaving the saloon, Marcus was learning exactly what Pete had meant. Word of the confrontation had spread through Mesa Verde with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve, and the reactions were as divided as Marcus had expected them to be. His first indication of trouble came when he stopped by Morrison's feed and supply to pick up grain for his horse. Ted Morrison, Pete's younger brother, looked up from his ledger with an expression of cold hostility that Marcus had never seen before. I hear you had some words with my brother today, Ted said without preamble. I had words with several people today, Marcus replied evenly, but treating a woman with basic human decency. That woman is trouble, Ted said flatly. Always has been, always will be. Pete was right to call her out, and you were wrong to interfere. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. Elena Vasquez has never caused trouble for anyone in this town. She's been the victim of trouble, not the cause of it. Her husband was a thief. Her husband was a thief, Marcus agreed. She wasn't. Ted slammed his ledger shut with more force than necessary. I think you should take your business elsewhere, Sullivan. We don't need customers who side with thieves and their women over honest folks. The rejection hit Marcus harder than he had expected. He had been buying supplies from Morrison's feed and supply for 5 years. Had never missed a payment or caused any problems, had considered Ted Morrison a friend, if not a close one. Now he was being turned away because he had stood up for a woman's right to be treated with basic respect. That's your choice, Ted, Marcus said quietly. But you might want to think about whether turning away, paying customers because they showed some human decency is good business. Practice. Marcus's second encounter came an hour later when he stopped by the barber shop for his weekly shave and haircut. Charlie Mendez, the barber who had been cutting his hair for 3 years, greeted him with obvious discomfort and nervous energy that suggested he had been dreading Marcus's arrival. Marcus, Charlie said hesitantly, I heard about what happened at the saloon. I imagine you did, Marcus replied, settling into the barber's chair. News travels fast in a town this size. Charlie picked up his razor, but didn't begin working, instead fidgeting with the blade while he struggled to find words for what he needed to say. The thing is, Marcus, I've got a business to run. A lot of my customers are, well, they're not happy about what you did today. Marcus studied Charlie's reflection in the mirror, seeing a man caught between his personal feelings and his economic survival. Charlie was Mexican-American, born in Mesa Verde, but always walking the careful line between acceptance and suspicion that came with his heritage. Elena's situation probably reminded him uncomfortably of his own vulnerability. So what are you telling me, Charlie? I'm telling you that maybe you should find another barber for a while. Until things cool down. Marcus stood up from the chair, understanding that Charlie's request was probably motivated more by fear than by personal animosity. I understand your position, Charlie. You've got to do what you think is best for your family. But as Marcus walked out of the barbershop, he couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. He was being ostracized by some members of the community for defending a woman who was being ostracized for her husband's crimes. The cycles of exclusion and judgment seemed to feed on themselves, creating an atmosphere where showing compassion could be seen as a dangerous act of rebellion. His third encounter was the most painful. As Marcus walked toward his horse, he was intercepted by Jim Crawford, his supervisor at the ranch, where he had worked for the past 4 years. Jim was a fair boss and a decent man, someone Marcus had always respected and whose opinion mattered to him. Marcus, Jim said, his expression serious but not hostile. We need to talk. They walked together toward a quiet corner of the street, away from the curious eyes and ears that seemed to be following Marcus's every move since word of the saloon confrontation had spread. I heard what happened today, Jim began. I also heard that you defended Elena Vasquez against some pretty harsh criticism. I defended a woman who was being mocked for trying to survive after her husband's death, Marcus replied. I'd do it again, Jim nodded slowly. I figured you would. That's one of the things I've always respected about you, Marcus. You've got principles, and you stick to them. But I need you to understand something about the situation you've put yourself in. Marcus waited, sensing that Jim's words were going to be important. The ranch does business with a lot of people in this community, Jim continued. Pete Morrison, Ted Morrison, and their friends represent a significant portion of our customer base. They buy our cattle, they recommend us to other buyers, and they have influence with the territorial authorities we sometimes need to work with. Marcus felt his stomach sink as he began to understand where this conversation was heading. I'm not saying you were wrong to stand up for Mrs. Vasquez, Jim said carefully. I'm saying that your public confrontation with Pete Morrison has created complications that affect more than just you. The ranch can't afford to be seen as taking sides in community disputes, especially when those disputes involve sensitive cultural issues. Are you firing me? Marcus asked bluntly. Jim was quiet for a long moment, his expression reflecting the internal struggle between his personal respect for Marcus and his business obligations. I'm giving you a choice. You can apologize to Pete Morrison, make peace with the men you confronted, and put this whole incident behind you. Or you can find another job. Marcus looked at his supervisor, a man he had worked with for 4 years, someone he had considered a friend, and realized that his defense of Elena Vasquez was going to cost him far more than he had initially calculated. But as he thought about Elena standing in that saloon, facing down a room full of hostile men with nothing but her own dignity and courage, Marcus knew his answer hadn't changed. I guess I'll be looking for another job, he said quietly. Jim nodded sadly. I figured that's what you'd say. For what it's worth, Marcus, I think you're a good man. But sometimes being a good man is expensive. As Marcus walked home through the dusty streets of Mesa Verde, past businesses where he was no longer welcome, and neighbors who now viewed him with suspicion, he reflected on the price of standing up for someone who couldn't defend themselves. In the space of a few hours, he had lost his job, his barber, his source of supplies, and probably several friendships. But as the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him why he loved this harsh but beautiful land, Marcus realized that he felt better about himself than he had in years. For the first time since arriving in Mesa Verde, he had taken a stand for something that mattered, had acted according to his principles, rather than his convenience. The question now was whether his family would understand and support his choice, or whether his defense of Elena Vasquez would cost him even more than he had already lost. The Sullivan family ranch sat 5 miles outside Mesa Verde, a modest but well-maintained operation that Marcus's father had built from nothing over 25 years of backbreaking work and careful management. As Marcus rode up the familiar dirt path that led to the main house, he could see warm light glowing in the windows and smoke rising from the chimney, signs of the domestic comfort that had anchored his life since childhood. Marcus's father, Patrick Sullivan, had emigrated from Ireland as a young man with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone around him. His mother, Catherine, had been a schoolteacher in Pennsylvania before marrying Patrick and following him west to the Arizona Territory. Together, they had raised 4 children and built a ranch that provided a decent living while maintaining the values of honesty, hard work, and respect for others that had guided their family for generations. As Marcus approached the house, he could hear voices from inside, his parents, his younger sister Mary, and his brother-in-law Robert, who worked the ranch alongside Patrick. The sounds of family conversation and evening meal preparations normally filled Marcus with contentment, but tonight he felt apprehensive about how they would react to the news he carried. "Marcus," called Mary as he stepped through the front door. At 25, she was the youngest of the Sullivan children, married to Robert for 3 years, and blessed with a warmth and optimism that made her the emotional center of the family. "We were wondering when you'd get here. Mama made that stew you like, and there's fresh bread from this afternoon." Catherine Sullivan emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron and studying her son's face with the perceptive eyes of a mother who had learned to read her children's moods and concerns. "You look troubled, Marcus. Has something happened?" Patrick Sullivan looked up from the ledger he had been reviewing at the kitchen table, his weathered face creased with the same concern that Marcus heard in his mother's voice. "Sit down, son. Tell us what's on your mind." Marcus accepted the bowl of stew that Mary pressed into his hands and settled into his customary chair at the family table, surrounded by the people whose opinions mattered most to him in the world. He had been dreading this conversation, afraid that his family might not understand or approve of the choices he had made, but now that the moment had arrived, he realized that honesty was the only option. I lost my job today, he began without preamble, and I may have made some enemies in town. The silence that greeted this announcement was immediate and complete. Robert set down his coffee cup with careful precision, while Mary reached across the table to touch her brother's hand with obvious concern. What happened? Patrick asked, his tone carrying no judgment, only the desire to understand the situation fully before forming opinions. Marcus told them everything. Elena Vasquez's entrance into the saloon, the cruel mockery she had been subjected to, his decision to defend her, and the confrontation that had followed. He described Elena's dignified response to her attackers, his subsequent rejections by various business owners, and finally, Jim Crawford's ultimatum that had cost him his job. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of evening settling over the ranch. Marcus waited for his family's reaction, prepared for disappointment, criticism, or advice about how he should have handled the situation differently. Instead, Patrick Sullivan leaned back in his chair and smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen since arriving home. "Well done, son," Patrick said firmly. "You did exactly what I would have expected from any child of mine." Catherine nodded emphatically, her eyes bright with pride. "That poor woman. To face such cruelty, and then to find the courage to confront those men directly, she must be extraordinarily strong." Mary's reaction was even more enthusiastic. "Marcus, you did the right thing. How could anyone expect you to sit there and listen to them mock a woman who's already suffered so much?" Robert, who had remained quiet during Marcus's story, finally spoke up with characteristic practicality. "Well, what will you do for work? Jim Crawford was a good boss, and jobs aren't easy to find around here." "I don't know yet," Marcus admitted. "I may have to look for something outside Mesa Verde, maybe in Phoenix or Tucson." "Nonsense," Patrick said with the tone of a man who had already made up his mind. "You'll work here. The ranch can support another hand, especially during spring roundup and branding season." Catherine stood up abruptly, her face animated with the kind of energy that usually preceded one of her projects to help someone in need. "This Elena Vasquez, is she truly as alone as it sounds? No family, no support?" "As far as I know, she's completely on her own," Marcus replied. "Her husband had no living relatives, and I don't think she has family in the area." "Then she needs friends," Catherine declared. "Real friends, not just people who feel sorry for her, but won't stand up to defend her when she's attacked." Patrick looked at his wife with the fond expression of a man who had been married long, enough to recognize when she was developing one of her charitable campaigns. "What are you thinking, Catherine?" "I'm thinking that a woman alone in a hostile community needs allies who aren't afraid of gossip or social pressure. I'm thinking that our family has never been particularly concerned with what the busybodies in Mesa Verde think about our choices." Catherine turned to look directly at Marcus. "I'm thinking that you should invite Mrs. Vasquez to Sunday dinner this week." Marcus felt his heart leap at the suggestion, though he tried to keep his voice casual. "You want to meet her?" "I want to show the people of Mesa Verde that the Sullivan family stands behind you and your principles," Catherine replied firmly. I want that woman to know that she has friends who value her character more than her husband's reputation." Mary clapped her hands together with obvious delight. "That's a wonderful idea, Mama. And maybe some of the other families will follow our example once they see that Elena Isn't Vasquez is just a good woman trying to make her way in the world." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "It would certainly send a message about what we stand for as a family." Patrick Sullivan stood up from the table and walked to the window that looked out over the land he had spent his life building into something meaningful and productive. "In Ireland, my family learned what it meant to be despised and rejected by people who thought themselves better than us. We came to America to escape that kind of treatment, to build lives where we would be judged by our actions rather than our ancestry." He turned back to face his family, his expression serious but determined. "If we turn our backs on Elena Vasquez now, if we let fear of social consequences keep us from doing what's right, then we've forgotten everything that brought us here in the first place. We've become the kind of people we came to America to escape." Catherine moved to stand beside her husband, her hand resting on his arm in the gesture of partnership that had sustained their marriage through decades of challenges. "Then it's settled. Marcus will invite Mrs. Vasquez to Sunday dinner, and we'll show Mesa Verde what the Sullivan family believes about treating people with decency and respect." As Marcus looked around the kitchen at the faces of his family, faces bright with support and determination, he felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the stew he had been eating. These were people who understood that doing the right thing sometimes came with costs, but that the cost of not doing the right thing was always higher in the end. "There's something else you should know," Marcus said, wanting complete honesty with the people who had just pledged their support to his cause. "I'm not just defending Elena Vasquez because it's the right thing to do. I'm defending her because I've come to care about her, more than I probably should, given the circumstances." The admission hung in the air for a moment before Mary broke the silence with a knowing smile. "We figured that out already, Marcus. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Sunday morning dawned clear and bright over the Arizona desert. with the kind of crystalline air that made the mountains seem close enough to touch and transform the harsh landscape into something approaching paradise. Marcus had risen early to help with the ranch chores, but his mind was entirely focused on the conversation he planned to have with Elena Vasquez after church services. The invitation to Sunday dinner had seemed like a perfect idea when his family proposed it. But now that the moment was approaching, Marcus found himself nervous about how Elena might react. She had been subjected to so much hostility and rejection from the community that an invitation from his family might seem like pity rather than genuine friendship. Or worse, like a trap designed to expose her to further humiliation. The Sullivan family attended services at the small Methodist church that served Mesa Verde's Protestant community, a modest wooden building that Patrick had helped construct during the town's early years. As they filed into their customary pew, Patrick and Catherine, followed by Mary and Robert, with Marcus taking his usual place at the end, Marcus was acutely aware of the whispered conversations and sideways glances that followed their entrance. Word of Thursday's confrontation at the Copper Dollar had spread through every household in Mesa Verde, and the community was clearly divided about Marcus's defense of Elena Vasquez. Some families nodded respectfully to the Sullivans, their expressions suggesting approval of Marcus's stand for basic human decency. Others pointedly ignored them or whispered behind their hands, in ways that left no doubt about their disapproval. Pete Morrison and his family occupied a pew near the front of the church, and Marcus could feel the man's hostile stare boring into the back of his head throughout Reverend Williams' sermon about loving one's neighbor and showing compassion to those in need. The irony of the biblical message seemed lost on Pete, but Marcus noticed several other congregants glancing meaningfully in his direction during particularly relevant passages. But the moment that transformed the entire morning came just as services were concluding and families were beginning to file out of the church for their usual socializing in the yard outside. Elena Vasquez appeared in the doorway of the church, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress that emphasized her dignity and composure. The effect of her entrance was immediate and dramatic. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, heads turned, and an uncomfortable silence settled over the congregation, as people tried to decide how to react to the presence of the woman who had become the center of so much controversy. Elena seemed to understand the discomfort her presence created, but she held her head high and walked into the church with the calm determination of someone who had decided that she would not be driven away from her own community's place of worship by gossip and prejudice. Marcus felt his heart swell with admiration for her courage, and he made his own decision in that moment. Standing up from his family's pew, he walked deliberately to where Elena had taken a seat in the back corner of the church, away from the other congregants. "Mrs. Vasquez," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the silent church, "would you do my family and me the honor of joining us for Sunday dinner today?" The invitation was delivered loudly enough for everyone in the building to hear, and Marcus noticed that several people leaned forward to catch Elena's response. This was the moment that would either begin Elena's reintegration into the community or cement her status as a permanent outcast. Elena looked up at Marcus with an expression that mixed surprise, gratitude, and something that might have been hope. "Mr. Sullivan, are you certain your family would welcome me?" "I'm certain they're eager to meet you," Marcus replied, extending his arm to escort her from the church. "My mother has been cooking all morning, and she'll be disappointed if you don't join us." As Elena rose from her seat and accepted Marcus's offered arm, Catherine Sullivan stood up from the family pew and added her own voice to the invitation. "Mrs. Vasquez, we would be delighted to have you join us. It's been too long since we've had proper company for Sunday dinner." The sight of the respected Sullivan family publicly welcoming Elena Vasquez created a ripple of reaction throughout the congregation. Some faces showed approval and relief, as if they had been waiting for someone else to take the first step toward treating Elena with basic human kindness. Others showed disapproval or confusion, uncertain about how to react to this unexpected development. But the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source. As Marcus and Elena walked toward the church exit, followed by his family, Reverend Williams stepped forward with a warm smile. "Mrs. Vasquez," the Reverend said, his voice carrying the authority of spiritual leadership, "I'm so pleased to see you in church this morning. I hope we'll see you regularly in the future. Our community is stronger when all of God's children feel welcome in his house." The minister's public endorsement of Elena's presence was a powerful statement that resonated throughout the church. Reverend Williams was a respected figure whose opinions carried weight with many of the families in Mesa Verde, and his clear acceptance of Elena sent a message that would influence community attitudes in ways that Marcus's individual defense could not achieve. As they walked out of the church together, Marcus noticed that several other families approached Elena with tentative but genuine greetings. Mrs. Henderson, whose husband owned the general store, made a point of introducing Elena to her daughters. Dr. Peterson and his wife stopped to chat briefly about Elena's health and well-being. Even Jake Wilson, who had participated in Thursday's cruel gossip session, approached with obvious embarrassment to offer a stammering apology for his behavior. The ride to the Sullivan Ranch was pleasant and relaxed, with Elena seated beside Marcus on the wagon seat, while his family filled the conversation with gentle questions about her background and interests. Marcus could see Elena gradually relaxing as she realized that the Sullivans' interest in her was genuine rather than merely polite, and that she was being welcomed into their family circle as an equal rather than a charity case. The Sunday dinner that followed was everything Marcus had hoped it would be and more. Elena proved to be an engaging conversationalist with interesting stories about her childhood in New Mexico, her brief career as a seamstress, and her observations about life in the Arizona Territory. She helped Catherine in the kitchen with the easy competence of someone accustomed to domestic work. And she listened to Patrick's stories about building the ranch with the kind of respectful attention that made the older man beam with pleasure. But the most significant moment came as they were finishing dessert and Elena was preparing to return to town. Patrick Sullivan cleared his throat with the formal manner that usually preceded important family announcements. "Mrs. Vasquez," he said, "Catherine and I have been discussing your situation, and we'd like to make a proposal." Elena looked up with curiosity and slight apprehension, unsure what to expect. "We understand that you've been having difficulty finding steady work in town," Patrick continued. "We also understand that our son Marcus is currently between jobs, having recently left his position at the Crawford Ranch." Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he began to understand what his father might be suggesting. "The Sullivan Ranch has grown to the point where we could use additional help, both with the livestock and with the domestic tasks that keep a working ranch functioning. We'd like to offer you a position here. Full-time work with fair wages, living quarters in our guest cabin, and the opportunity to be part of a community that values your contributions." Elena stared at Patrick in amazement, clearly struggling to process the unexpected offer. "Mr. Sullivan, I don't know what to say. Your generosity is overwhelming." Catherine leaned forward with a warm smile. "Say yes, dear. This ranch needs someone with your intelligence and work ethic. And you need a place where you can build a new life without constantly facing judgment for your husband's mistakes." Marcus watched Elena's face as she considered the offer. Seeing hope and relief war with the caution that months of rejection and hostility had taught her. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I accept," she said simply. "And I promise you won't regret giving me this chance." As the sun set over the Arizona desert that Sunday evening, Marcus stood on his family's front porch, watching Elena settle into the guest cabin that would be her new home. For the first time since Thursday's confrontation at the Copper Dollar, he felt genuinely optimistic about the future. He had lost a job, made some enemies, and faced social ostracism for defending a woman's dignity. But in return, he had gained something far more valuable: the respect of his family, the satisfaction of acting according to his principles, and the opportunity to be part of Elena Vasquez's journey from scorned widow to valued member of a community that had finally learned to see past prejudice to character. As Elena lit the lamp in her cabin window, Marcus realized that sometimes the greatest victories came not from winning battles, but from choosing to fight for what was right, regardless of the cost. And sometimes, when you stood up for someone who couldn't defend themselves, you discovered that you weren't standing alone after all. You were standing with everyone who mattered most.